Hey Alex, how are you?
I am great. How are you doing, Kiah?
I'm fantastic. I am so excited to be kicking off this series with you. I feel like I'm somewhat of an AI novice, and it's such a brave new world out there, and I'm so happy you're here to like hold my hand and guide me forward and talk a little bit about AI and banking.
Such a hot topic right now. I cannot wait to dig in.
Okay, so you're such an expert. I imagine that you've outsourced large parts of your life to AI. What is the most recent way you've used AI that maybe I could relate to or the audience could relate to?
Sure. So, in a work context, what I recently did is I used Claude as my preferred model, and I used the MCP that Claude has to basically pull in all of the transcripts of every phone call I've had for the last 6 months with any prospect or customer to surface a list of prioritized features that we want to focus on next for our company.
Oh, amazing. So you had these conversations, you were recording them, and then you maybe just didn't like write down in the moment what you had been thinking about. And then 6 months is a lot of conversations, right?
It's hundreds of conversations. Yes. Yes.
And did you find anything interesting?
I found fascinating things. So one, trying to synthesize 100 conversations by hand is a truly like impossible thing. But the system, Claude, is really, really good at synthesizing. Like that's its number one use case for a lot of Copilot apps. And so for us, it was great. It surfaced things that maybe we kind of heard in the conversation, but didn't put that much importance on. And then this impartial synthesis said, these top three have to be focused on first. And so that was really helpful for us to think through that, which is great. And then another personal thing. Yeah, it is. And another personal thing I just did is my husband and I are traveling in August to do a trek around the Mont Blanc, the mountain in France. And I used it to plan the whole trek from start to finish.
Okay, are you gonna, like, fact check anything to make sure it didn't make up anything? Or, like, what's how much are you outsourcing versus how much gets, like is it you add other information?
So I do fact check it. I actually pitch models against each other. So I'll feed one output into the other and ask it to cross check. I'll have it pull
Oh,
specific
amazing.
sources. Yeah, I'll have it kind of run specific background checks and yeah, that it there's a lot there to make sure it's not giving me something
Okay.
terrible and we're not getting lost in the
Yeah.
mountains. Yeah.
Right, like, I feel like that's a really good use case, but kind of in a weirdly high risk travel situation. So I would hate for you to get lost on the mountain because you were given, like, the wrong directions, like, in the GPS, and you turned down a road that doesn't exist or whatever.
More on this in August when we regroup to find out
Yeah,
whether it was
let's circle back.
successful.
Oh, honestly, I'm gonna make a note right now and hopefully feed it through Claude, and Claude will tell me, "Hey,
Yeah.
Kia, in the August show, you will have to make sure you asked her about how it went."
There you go.
So I use Claude. I am a baby user. I am not outsourcing my mountain treks to Claude. I looked at how I use Claude, and I use it a lot to come up to help me prep for interviews or podcasts, or especially like the research function,
Yeah.
checking those source docs, and then also sometimes I'll use it to help me come up with interview questions. And the interview questions are sometimes like they're so like LinkedIn Signal, and I'm like, no, like let's not. But at least like it's a little bit easier for me to edit than to sometimes like fully whole cloth come up with a question, or the question that it suggests reminds me of a different question that's actually like a little bit better fit. And so I've been thinking about like how to leverage some of that strength without feeling like you're doing my job and like you're doing like the things that I'm special and good at,
Yeah.
especially like, as a writer.
Yeah. Well, I actually
Okay,
think that your
so
job is probably
yeah,
safe here just a little bit longer than some other like tasks that can be more fully automated. Because I actually think the
sure.
LLMs are so bad at creative writing for now. The maybe things will change in a few
Right.
months, but it's usually synthesizing or leveraging other sources that it's reading and kind of pulling from. And I think creative writing is very original. Like you have to have your own ideas. And I do think that you'll be safe for a while there. I think so. Yeah.
Well, I mean, no pressure on the creativity portion. So thank you for that. No, I wanted this first conversation to kind of level set where we are with AI in banking. In part because, my personal observation, especially covering, the technology in the community bank space, is that bankers, you know, I think the internet and smartphones really brought in kind of a wave of digitization, a wave of technology channels. And that has kind of been like enough for some banks, and that then they were trying to maybe digitize different processes, arguably on the consumer side first. And then AI was coming in, let's say 2015 to 2021. And banks, there was like this data component. They were also like kind of scared. Also, the models were like very finicky, kind of. And it just wasn't like, it didn't seem like that big of a focus. And then all of a sudden, to me, it exploded with ChatGPT 4, I think. What has it been like for you? Kind of over this time period, what have you seen?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I agree in 2022, 2023, this advent of the kind of generative era, the large language model era really exploded with the open AI progress. And I think in the beginning, so we are a company, Parlay, we offer an AI powered system on the lending side. And I remember trying to pitch this to lenders who were like, whoa, 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 that sounds very risky. Why do we need AI? No, thank you. A human being and their judgment is what's required, etc., which all very valid considerations. But I think in the beginning, there was more resistance in the banking space than not because it is highly regulated. There are a lot of requirements. Safety and soundness is paramount. You can't just yeet software into the environment and then be like, it's fine, we'll figure out later what that does. That is not okay. And so I think more resistance at the beginning was very much what we encountered. And then suddenly, I'd say in the last 12 months, there's been this, oh, okay, now this is a priority for everyone. My bank board has mandated that we find ways to use AI. How do we use it? Let's go. So that's been awesome. And then I would say one of the things that has been crazy is starting 23, the concept of a generative AI kind of co-pilot style application came to be. Hey, I can use
Okay.
Claude to generate or draft a first email. I can build a prompt that it can use to quickly screen something for me or evaluate something for me. This very much like Copilot. I work, but I work faster as a human sort of theme and application was the first one that people got excited about. And then I would say in the last 6 to 9 months, it's flipped. It's flipped from this thing can generate things for me that I can review and be more efficient with to, okay, the technology has now matured and it can now do things on my behalf. The notion of AI agent as colleague has emerged. It's emerged generally, not just in banking, but I think with banking, there are so many more considerations up front that have to be handled that I would say the last 6 months, I've seen that explosion really at scale in the banking space too.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so important about having this conversation, especially for bankers, is to understand that it feels like their orientation, their interest in AI has gone from, you know, within like 12, 24 months, scared, don't touch it, can't use it, big risk, to what have you got? Give it to me. Like, and I think, we don't see change that fast in financial services. And so it's actually really interesting to both kind of note this like orientation change or this approach, and then also to understand the technology still moved faster than that, right?
Yes, it did. And it is moving faster than anything we have ever seen. Like the only thing I can liken this to is the kind of like the chip cycles where we used to say every 7 years a chip will get half the size and then it's going to go faster and faster. AI is that but on steroids. In the last 6 months in the space, we have gone across, so not banking specific, I'd say just across all companies. We've gone from a world where human beings, software engineers, were the ones primarily coding with maybe some AI checks for quality control to, hey, it's now possible for agents to code as well as or better and faster than humans. And now humans are quality checking and controlling what agents build. And so that is a crazy flip on its head. It changes how quickly products can be built. It changes disadvantage. Historically, if you were a small institution with two people, there's no way that you could build product or service as quickly and as efficiently as a really big company. That disadvantage is no longer. And so I think it's amazing for community banks and credit unions that are on the smaller side, because historically, their disadvantage, maybe, which was scarcity of resources, constraints on size, number of personnel at the bank, that is no longer a disadvantage in this era, which is insane. So it's amazing from my viewpoint.
Yeah, a numbers, like a number of employees versus like a skills issue of the employees that
Yes.
you do have.
Yes.
So where are the big AI companies? I know we've mentioned Claude, we've mentioned OpenAI. Where are they when it comes to bank partnerships, interest in the financial services space in general? Because you mentioned coding within a bank. What else should we be thinking about?
Yeah. So again, it's so fun that we get to have this conversation right now because everything is changing at once. It truly feels like. So folks are probably tracking the foundational models, right? You've got your big AI companies that build the chat GPTs, that build the Claudes, that build the copilots. You know, those applications are out in the world for people to use, both at an enterprise level and at an individual level. So that's one type. And what they're doing is they're saying, the system can do anything. Here are all of these use cases we can do. Use us in XYZ vertical. Financial services is very hot right now because historically it was an area where there was a lot of context and a lot of like, well, this is institutional knowledge, so no software will help me because my institutional knowledge is locked into my institution. That's flipped again. And so I think of three types of big AI companies. You've got your foundational models, which, they have a large language model essentially that they extend out to everyone in the world. And I think of that like the engine. So that they're the companies building the engine that powers other things. And then you have platform or infrastructure companies that are basically using that engine and building a car of some type around it. They're the ones who are essentially saying, okay, well, I'm going to set how this engine works. I'm going to make the thing that makes it turn on and go the way it's supposed to in the constraints that it needs to know. And then you have one final one, which is the agent specific ones where companies are saying, I have drivers for your cars and I'm going to sell you these drivers. So I think of it like that. Engine, car, driver is like the three types of companies out there.
Yeah. So the foundation model, is that the Chat GPT? Is that or where is Claude? Like which one is Claude my driver? Is Claude my engine? Is Claude my car?
Yeah. So one of the fun aspects of this is everyone is trying to do everything. So technically your Claude I would call your engine. But Claude has just come out with, they have an SDK so that you can build your own agents that is available through Claude. So they're essentially saying, I have the car slash like the engine, but also I have the blueprint for making agents. Do you want to use mine? And I think all three layers of companies are kind of trying to figure out whether they're just going to own one slice or whether they're going to be able to, in some way, own more than one slice of this stack at a time.
Yeah, I have been also, I feel like I'm reading the press releases, so I'm like kind of at the end of this,
Yes.
but I have
Yes.
been seeing that, ChatGPT came out with like kind of a personal financial thing, an agent
Hmm.
up interface, and I wonder how close we are to, you know, if ChatGPT is our foundational model, if it's our engine and our car, and they're building your personal finance agent, your accountant, your
Yeah.
wealth advisor,
Yeah.
your banker, your
Mm.
or to imagine like you're the CEO of the company and it builds your CFO. That has been a really interesting development. Obviously, like somewhat natural, but the question too is, are banks like one kind of set up to interact with this party, this identity, and then two, like could the bank also build me a CFO? Like, why does it have to come from ChatGPT? You know, so that's been kind of an interesting development or a little wrinkle, I think, with some news that has recently come out.
I agree. And I think that when I think about the banking space, from experience working in it, a lot of what's coming out from the foundational models is a lot of like, hey, here are all the parts for these things, right? So you've got your foundational model, here are the parts for your car, and here are the parts for the person who drives the car. You can assemble it however you want. And that is really cool for various applications. Like if you're a small business, that's fantastic. You no longer need to buy 5 products and pay a bunch of licenses. You could build it yourself. I have friends who run their own businesses who, using Claude Code, have built entire back office systems to manage the operations of that small business, right? That it's so cool, and you don't need to have the depth of coding that you used to initially to be able to get to that level. Where that gets hard is in banking. You need more transparency, you need more rigor, you need more guardrails to do things right. So I think that's where it comes, if you're a bank and you're wondering, can I just do all of this myself? No, you cannot build a foundational model by yourself. That's billions and billions, probably at this point trillions of dollars invested into building, maintaining, improving those systems today. I don't see that being something that banks will ever build internally. But now I think you are at a crossroads where you can say, okay, well, I have all the parts to build this car and the driver who's going to drive it. Do I have the internal skills and resources not only to build it, but also to maintain it? And maintaining is where the cost benefit piece of why don't we just build this ourselves usually changes, because building something today has never been easier, but then like maintaining it, making it auditable, making it verifiable, having it work so it doesn't break, especially if it's propping up other systems, that's really hard. And so that's where I think specialized vendors in banking will remain to basically oversee, manage, maintain the car and driver components of these agentic processes long term.
You were just describing like essentially a DIY approach, and I am the least DIY person in the entire world. And so I am just thinking about all of these banks that are maybe excited, but maybe kind of are underestimating the DIY element of like, if you're not a carpenter and you accidentally get into some carpentry, like that's a big skill learn. And hopefully, you're both excited about it, but also you understand when you should maybe outsource it. You mentioned again, bankers went from being like so scared of AI to so into AI. But then
Mhm.
also, banks don't have foundational models. So, how are, like, in your experience, what are you seeing banks interacting with AI? How are they playing with the parts and what are they building with it?
Yes. So there is a spectrum of sophistication for sure. Some very tech forward banks who are comfortable leaping in with that DIY frame and saying, okay, well, we used to have XYZ system that, was homegrown and didn't work that great, that sat on top of another system and we didn't love it. So now we're just going to rip that out and start again. That's phenomenal, but it does require in house expertise to do that. And where I've seen that work is a couple of bankers, and hopefully we'll have a few of them join us to kind of talk to this work that they've been doing as well. A few bankers are starting to talk about this concept of the bank OS. They're like, well, all this data about how my bank works has been trapped for ages in all these systems that I have that don't talk to each other. And now I can build basically an overlay that shows me everything at a glance. Maybe historically that was Power BI's role or whatever, and now banks can just generate that themselves, which is awesome. I'd say another really easy or clear one that I've seen is one of the one of the revenue generating tenants of the bank. This could be on the loan side, this could be on the deposit side. there are multiple processes inherent within that that are labor and time intensive today. It is now possible to layer in systems that can take some of that manual work off the desk so that if you have four folks working on the deposit side or five folks working on the loan side, you can now do 10x more without having to hire people basically to scale up as that volume grows. And I think that is really cool. I love that. And yeah, that's what we're seeing. And then for those who maybe aren't the DIY flavor, we're seeing a lot of really cool collaborations with vendors in the space to say, okay, I want to use your agents in this context, or I want to use the car, the harness, if you will, of how the model should work, because you've built the right guardrails for my agents to exist and to do things in a compliant way. So that's kind of the two ways we've seen it.
Yeah, it occurs to me under this DIY approach, you mentioned the auditability, the kind of quality assurance. It's almost like if you're a bank, you're going to have to build the skill set, you're going to have the builder skill set, and then you'll have to almost have like the audit skill set and have that expertise, and you can't maybe outsource some of that. Like if you have, more of a vendor partnership, you can't be like, okay, well, show me what you the vendor have done, and then we'll kind of fact check your work. You have to kind of get really good at fact checking your own work. And I think about that as a journalist, that when did I become the editor of myself? And now that I write this newsletter, I don't have an editor. So I thank God for 10 years I had very, very strong incentives around being a good editor and separately a good writer. And those are arguably two different skill sets. And you need both to do certain types of work.
Yes, and that is the perfect way to think about the phase that we're in right now, in my view, which is you do have to be really careful about the way in which work gets done, right? So you have your background where you've worked with really good editors, so as you're working to like avoid this, minefield, or don't do this, or make
Uh-huh.
sure to cut that. Right now is the phase in which we as humans can put in those guardrails for agents because we know how to spot an error, or we know to say that math looks wrong, do it again. But it has to be done now, and it has to be done right, because large language models, they are optimized, they're rewarded to find you an answer, to give you an output. It doesn't have to be right. That's not what it's rewarded for unless you explicitly build in that reward schema, right? To say, if you say, Kiah, is this compliant with XYZ law? Well, an LLM will confidently say, yes, it's compliant with, because there is no punishment, if you will, if that's wrong. And so we have to know that now, putting that in, because otherwise the risk is that you may 10x the efficiency of a workflow using an agent, but you could 10x a bad thing. And trying to look back at that, if you can't see it logged a certain way, introduces tremendous risk to the financial institution.
I mean, you bring up a really important point too, which is like, what are regulators, examiners, politicians like? Where are they when it comes to this application of AI in financial services? We're talking, why a bank would need to care about this, but obviously there's some external stakeholders that also care, right?
Yes, there are a lot of external stakeholders. We could probably do an entire session about the regulatory standpoint right now, because it is one of those scenarios again where regulators know what to examine when they have a body of work to look back on, but stuff is changing day to day, and that body of work to look back on is changing day to day as well. And so I remember we've had some chats, to kind of talk about what our product does, and get some input from regulators early. And I've had them, from across, OCC, FDIC, et cetera, teams say, well, when we hear AI, it's sort of a red flag kind of goes off in our mind of what we now need to look at, which is that's their job, right, to identify risk and to enable and kind of ensure safety and soundness. But when the technology itself is changing so quickly, it is very hard to do that. And so I think right now the consensus from regulators is let's let let's let the market essentially define what the right standards should be, but also don't like compromise on safety and soundness and auditability and model risk management. But that's not the most actionable framework to work in. I'd be curious on what you're seeing as well from the regulatory side there.
Well, it's interesting because I think there's just, regulators kind of do a lot of their work privately. And then there's some work that is either signaled or discussed publicly. We know that they are trying to change or update their approach to model risk management, but AI models were excluded from that. And, there's kind of some good and bad
Yes.
parts about that. I think one of the
Fascinating.
issues yeah. I think one of the issues is timing, right? Like, we don't kind of have the benefit of timing here. And I also have been thinking, and this is like my own little hobby horse, that, the wide variety of banks, and I know you interact with many of these. You see the biggest banks and the most sophisticated banks to the smallest banks and the least sophisticated. And I think about how there needs to kind of be a floor of acceptability, and that the way that regulators telegraph this is they're like, here are expectations. We'll make them like only so legible. It's not like, I referee soccer and there's a whole law book and everyone can read this law book. And then the issue is how it's enforced by referees. We have laws and rules in banking, but but they don't tell you 100% like how to pass fail kind of. And I've been thinking like, man, there should be really like an SRO or a standard, what is it? Standard regulatory organization, standards organization around AI so that it creates the floor for some of these banks to say, at minimum, it has to be this. Here are the minimum
Mhm.
standards. This is your C level work. This is your pass, right? This isn't your A level work. And you can do more than your A level work. But that for some of these banks, they really need more guidance. They really
It's
don't wanna
true.
mess it up. They wanna do something,
That's
and
right.
they just kinda need to be told, like, what's the and I don't wanna say like MVP, the minimum viable product, but,
Yeah.
like, what
The
is
floor.
the yes, what is your floor to do this? And AI is, like, I think the best place for
It
this
is.
thing to exist,
It
and
is.
I don't know if it's NIST, I don't know if it's, like, the trade groups, ABA, ICBA,
Mhm.
I don't
Mhm.
know, like, who this would come from. But I think there needs to be a group that like, we need the FINRA or the FASB or the
Mhm.
AICPA for AI and
For
banking.
this. Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And people sometimes will draw and they'll be like, well, the NIST AI kind of principles is what you should use, or California or Colorado have some legislation, but like no one has agreed to your point on this is the standard. And I think none of it applies to agentic, right? Like all of it applies to a model. Okay, great. But when it's a large language model that everyone uses and it's kind of like a toll booth system, like I drew down gas, and then I put it into my engine, you can't explain actually. Like model risk management is very difficult when you don't have the model itself, right, available to like fully test to that extent. And so that's going to be really hard. And when we get to delegated work, the agent did this work on my behalf. Blue ocean. There is very very little, if any, guidance on that, and that's going to be a big problem. You covered the bass stuff so well. Like you, Jason, Alex covered the like, oh my god, what happened? And then the kind of what emerged, what floated to the surface was, well, we didn't have this way of tracking this, and oh well, this back office thing wasn't in place, and that's caused this huge issue. I think I'm like, okay, where's AI's equivalent? Because I think the impact will be much bigger, much broader, but similar level of we don't know how to reconcile this thing that happened because we don't have that visibility into how things were done. I see that like a big glaring light just coming our way.
Yeah, and the reason why I want an SRO and I don't necessarily want it to be regulars is going back to the banking as a service, third party risk management, they just kind of can't update fast enough. And there needs to be kind of a group that is keeping up with these and kind of fully interested. And also, like, I think the other thing too is it shouldn't be a fail situation, like, and I think regulators, the enforcement element just means that the incentives are all wrong. So I do empathize with banks that feel like they both need more regulatory clarity. You might never get that regulatory clarity, and we'll just have to have like kind of a cautious risk management, approach going forward, to your analogy about driving the car. Everyone's gotta get a driver's license. Everyone's gotta probably have to drive in some bad weather conditions. There's gonna be some car crashes. It would be nice if we had really good everyone had really great insurance and everyone drove the speed limit, but we're all kind of in the cars, you know?
We're all kind of in the cars. Some of them have been built by people who make cars, and some of them we've like tacked together and we've like launched onto the
Uh-huh.
road. And the question of what's going to happen
Totally.
is very unclear. Yeah.
So, we've also, like, one of the things about the state of AI, we've got the, like, what's real regulators, what's in operation, but also I think there's a lot of, like, especially if you're a community banker or you're a banker who, like, worries about being kind of left behind, there's a lot of, like, social signaling. Can we talk about the social signaling? Where do you see signaling? And what do you like, how would you tell me to interpret what I'm seeing with the social signaling on, like, let's say social media?
Well, first of all, if you've recently opened LinkedIn, I'm sure that you were inundated by signaling from every person in community banking in America being like, I completely cracked this thing that now takes 1 second that my agent does for me with no work at all. And that sounds
Yes.
cool.
I
Good
built
for
this
them.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I built it over the weekend and now it does everything for me. This is what community
Right.
bankers should care about, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, okay, everyone calm down. I think
Yeah.
there's
It's
a,
insane.
it's very annoying. It actually makes going on LinkedIn really like not that pleasant anymore because I'm just like, ugh, enough with the signaling. So the thing that I always think of is one, I think a lot of this signaling comes from this urge to solution. Like people are out there talking about solutions. They're like, I have this hammer. Oh my God. And then they're like running around trying to smash everything that looks like a nail with AI. Okay, great. I don't think like that at all. And I think pragmatic builders have to start with a problem and then figure out whether AI is the solution. It might be, it might not be, first of all. Second of all, anytime a banker says, I completely crushed this workflow and now it takes me 1 second and I don't touch it once, great. Is that in production? Is that in test? Is that a pilot? Is that like live and touching customer data? Is this on like test data? What are we talking about here? Right? Is this real or did you just experiment and you're bragging about an experiment? That's how I think about it.
Honestly, the experimentation, the process of, like, where are we in a flow? And then how are we operationalizing? And then also, I think to me, use cases so good, but I'm also very interested in process. How are we, we did a thing. How are we then going to test our processes? How are we going to bring in a lot of stakeholders? Who did I involve in this? Also, and I think in like social sciences, what didn't work? And why didn't it work, right? Like, how do I learn from the things that I'm not using or the experiments that failed, right?
Yes, so much, and like this is a common framework, but it applies so much in AI. Is you may have cracked some cool process experimentally, in test or in prod. I'd be very curious about that, but like you may have cracked some interesting tech step, right? Where you said I collapsed down this workflow. Great. Okay. But then process, I actually think, is the most important predictor of success long term. And you put your finger on it. So I'm going to come back to it. And then people. Do people agree that that work can be replaced? Are you changing the jobs that they now have to do? And how are you doing that across the bank to ensure that the interaction of agent and human is like as good as possible? The guardrails and oversight is there, and like all of this stuff can flow well. Every time we do a bank project, an onboarding, whatever it takes, the first thing we do is we map process. And anytime process is not clear, which is probably 85% of the time, we know that that has to be attacked first, because wherever you layer in technology, if it's a bad process, it will be worse with tech in the loop, unless you're planning on eliminating human beings altogether in said process, which sometimes makes sense, but sometimes does not, right? Like if it's lending and the balance sheet of the bank ultimately is going to be impacted, then like, cool, you might want a human in the loop there checking things. And if humans and agents are interacting, we need to teach people how to do that and agree who owns what. So yeah, there's a lot there that has to go well. And I think there are some visionary banks who are decomposing down these tasks and these processes and these workflows to make those implementation successful, but I think the grand majority are still wrangling what it looks like to do that in prod with humans and regulators and all of that. Like my day-to-day bank operations are now in the mix. And so actually this is why a lot of early implementations we've seen be very successful are back-end agentic processes. So hey, the human being that is my customer of my bank's experience is not impacted, but materially we've shortened the processing time on the back end, or the
Yes.
review time on the
Yeah.
back end, or the time it takes to generate XYZ decision. Amazing. When you put them on the front end, that's where things can get more complex. That's where you have to think about UDAP. That's where accuracy, messaging, guardrails, all of that. The stakes heighten a lot.
Well, and so when we were talking and prepping for this, you mentioned agentic is messy. And I think one of the things about the social signaling that we see on LinkedIn or we see on Twitter is that people are kind of downplaying the mess or, in the experimentation that's maybe not being
Yes.
discussed other than the separate horror stories that will come out of it. So can we talk a little bit about AI being or agentic specifically kind of being messy or for me asking you to, how are you going to make sure that your travel planning agent is not going to send you to get lost in the mountains, right?
Yes. Yes. So it is super messy. I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we haven't all agreed on what an agent is.
Okay.
It's pretty interesting. Yeah. So what actions get taken by what system in what form is still, in my view, very much being worked through. Like in our system, we built a very much a like our initial cut of our product was generative. Let me generate an analysis of a deal for a human to agree on and to action. Technically, it is agentic, even in that first cut, because it was pulling data from different sources, it was reconciling it, it was enabling and validating calculation, but it was not a chatbot where you talk to an agent, and it was not a agent can send this email on my behalf agent, right? So like there are different levels of autonomy, and I think the messiness comes not just from that we haven't agreed on what an agent is, but also the harness, like where the agents live and what they do, is still being built. So there are off the shelf tools. N8N is one. Sometimes people use Claude code to like pull in their agents and to build their agents, but like the thing in which they live is still actively being built too. And to some extent, the thing in which they live defines how they act. And so that's the other piece of this. Are there circuit breakers where you tell the agent to stop? Is it allowed to continue until such point as you tell it to stop? How does it know what's right or wrong? Have you given it enough context to understand the action it's being asked to take, right? Like all of those things we are still defining right now. So that's why it's messy.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's it's funny because I do love I've seen, like, comparisons of, like, Amelia Bedelia but when you talk to an agent, sometimes you, like, assume it has human knowledge around, like,
Yes.
"Well, I wouldn't have never asked you to delete my entire database. Why would you delete my entire database? That
Yes.
wasn't even in the
Oh my
scope."
God.
And
Yes.
it's like, "No, no, no, it doesn't know anything." Like,
It doesn't know.
if you didn't
Yeah.
tell it, if it
It
wasn't
has no
programmed,
idea.
it doesn't know. Like,
Hmm.
yeah.
And that's the
And so it's
fascinating
so
piece.
interesting,
Yeah.
yeah.
Your example is great, right? I think the prompt that originally caused that database deletion was optimize my database. And the agent was like, well, I optimized it by deleting it. No, oh my God, right? But like that then comes down to like, how is the agent designed? How much autonomy did you give it? What context does it have to make the decisions? Even that context layer is still being kind of refined, right? So, like in lending, which is the place where I spend all of my time, an agent, if it's given a framework for approving a loan or moving a deal forwards, it might look at the parameters you gave it and say, this deal is good. But there might be historical data the bank has for why approving a loan like that in the past was actually a really bad plan, right? Like there was some indicator of risk that actually we have as knowledge institutionally that we did not feed to the agent. And so what's currently being worked on as well is, all right, how do we build this memory layer that agents can access so that they know what frameworks they're allowed to operate in and what they're allowed to do? So I think it's the best, but also the messiest piece right now is trying to figure out how all of these things work together in a way that is not risky or exposing the bank to the risk that they do not want to be exposed to so that they can safeguard what they do, not be attacked by the regulators, and not put their customers at risk.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think will be really useful to keep in mind for the rest of this series, and as we think about technology changing in the future, is that these attitudes, the social signaling, the very what I would say is dramatic change from lots of caution to lots of comfort. How when in your work, how do you think about how people are conceptualizing this, and what do we need to kind of keep in mind as we move through the promise and the peril of AI? Like how do we kind of keep the course on this and not be like too scared or too excited?
Yeah. Oh, okay, that's a hard question. I think it has never been easier to leverage agentic systems to cut down on manual work that is time consuming and currently expensive to do. At the same time, it has never been more important for us to put a governance framework around what a system can do on your behalf and what actions they're allowed to take. So I would say the promise is real. We truly can do things today that were not possible or that were 10x, maybe 100x more expensive or time consuming or resource consuming generally to do. And we can't stop thinking like a financial institution about risk. And so balancing those two things is very hard. There are some leading bankers in the space who are thinking through this the right way, who are having to put in place governance frameworks that will take time, that they're still building to make sure that that works. And in the interim, we're seeing those smaller scale, more restricted, more careful experiments and kind of workflow automation progress that have more human in the loop or generally just guardrails where humans have to look at and agree and say, yes, I agree with this decision or this action and proceed.
I think that's so smart. I can personally, I'm so like skeptical and like also a little scared of AI. And I try to tell myself like that's probably not going to be a very useful orientation going forward. And I both need to kind of change and update how I think about this, while also being like, it's not, I'm not unreasonable for sometimes being skeptical. My skepticism will serve me, hopefully, but I don't want to be kind of governed by my skepticism, right? I can use both my curiosity and my skepticism as I learn both about like how other people use AI, and then also to think about where in my workflow or where in my life it makes sense to bring in this tool. And I think like I wasn't writing when we first like everyone got computers, but I kind of remember like what it was like to have the internet come in and like the like safety things they told us about the internet, and that for other people it probably would have been a really big shift for them to go from having no internet to only internet, all internet. And so that like this is AI is like I think exponentially, more than the internet as far as a tool goes, but it's not like it's I have done this before, you know?
Hmm. I once had a lender tell me, she was like, I remember before Microsoft Excel when we had paper sheets to do spreading. And every time
The
we made a
spreadsheets,
mistake,
yeah,
you
the
had
paper
to white it
spreadsheet.
out. Yes. And I was like, okay, so she's
Yeah,
comfortable with these cycles, these iteration changes.
right.
But yeah, we've come far and we can do even more now than we could back then. But I think here the experience and the skill you have of like, but I know all these things about how regulators work and how banks need to operate is actually the best thing because what I've observed is, I think social media, right, did this thing where it polarized everyone into different corners of their mind space, their beliefs, etc. I kind of think that large language models do the opposite. They kind of like move everyone towards the middle on like what is right or how something should be done. And that's really great for normal efficiency things, like help me find the most efficient route to get to the bank today or whatever. But it doesn't work when there are regulatory traps or safety and soundness considerations or rule sets that apply whether the agent knows them or not. So I think you have the optimal mix of I've never had easier off the shelf tools to use. And I have all of this very specific knowledge that is integral to those things working within the right guardrails.
Yes. Okay, Alex, this is a perfect segue to, how we're going to conclude all of our shows, which is with a little bit of homework. And so I have asked you to come up with some like a task every episode that's kind of related thematically to the episode for me to try so I can increase my familiarity with AI. So, what is your challenge or task for me?
Okay, my challenge or task, if you have Claude, which I think you said
I
you do,
do.
is I challenge you to connect a few of your systems into Claude using the MCP, so connectors function. Go ahead and
Okay.
connect your email, connect your calendar, and then connect your
Okay.
drive or wherever your current work lives. If you
Yeah.
take notes, if you have a note taker, connect that in and then see whether the system can help you with a task
Yeah.
that currently takes a lot of time and is manual and repetitive to you. So for me, it was
Mm.
reviewing call logs. For you, it could be research
Yep.
or
Yep.
drafts of documents and prompt the system to pull in some of the stuff that you've built across that network of connectors. So Drive, email, whatever it is, and see what it can generate for you. Because one of the things that shocked me was historically when I used to write about our company. We have an elevator pitch. This is what we do. This is why it matters. That stuff. I'd have to write it from scratch. Even if I got Claude to draft me a first cut at something, it didn't feel like me. It didn't feel like my tone. It didn't align with the beliefs and the things that I know have to go into that. But connectors give context. And so you will be shocked by how much context the system can pull from your own ideas, from your existing conversations, to generate something that feels remarkably similar or close or aligned to how you might digest or generate something. And tell me,
You
tell me
are gonna
how
laugh
it
at me
goes.
so.
Yeah.
This is when you said my note-taking app,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm holding up a
Feed
recorder
it
from
in.
Sony.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I use to record my interviews. There's a manual audio recording. There's not always a there, and then I'll generate a transcript later. But yes, I will connect my things. I will try to figure out one process that Claude can do for me based off those connections, and I will report back how it's gone.
And if you find that it helps you optimize something, we can save that prompt as a skill. That's part two in case you're
Oh my
going for
gosh.
extra credit.
All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much for chatting with me about the state of AI. I cannot
Mhm.
wait to continue this conversation in a couple of weeks.
Likewise.